The screams cut and cut. People were becoming frenzied and hysterical. I heard loud weeping. Then suddenly the noise died. My mother stopped screaming. There were whispers. I peered into the hallway. Two dark, bearded men came along the hallway. Behind them walked a man of medium height, wearing a dark coat and a dark suit. He walked in the path cleared by the tall, bearded man. People murmured softly as he passed. His presence seemed to fill the apartment with white light. It was the Reb. Behind the Reb walked two more tall, bearded men. The Reb was in my house. I was certain my mother was dead. I lay down on the floor in my room and I wept. Later, someone remembered me. I was taken to a neighbor's apartment. The next day, I was brought back. My mother was not dead. She lay in her bed, but I could not see her. Uncle Yakov had been in an accident, my father explained, a car accident in Detroit while traveling with the Reb. My Uncle Yakov was my mom's only brother. He had been to our apartment only 3 days before. He would visit us all the time. He lived alone 2 blocks away. He was the short and slight and dark-haired, with brown eyes and thin lips. He looks like my mother. He was studying history and Russian affairs. He was to be the advisor to the Reb. His favorite expression was, "What's new in the world?" He spoke in a soft voice and was gentle. Now he was dead of a car accident at the age of 27. The following day, my mother was taken to the hospital. That Shabbos, my father sang his father's melody to Ro Rabam Alum. We were in the older brother's home a few blocks away from us, for his sister-in-law would not hear of us having Shabbos in our apartment without my mother. We sat at the table that Friday, and there were long silences and feeble attempts at the Zemeros by my father's brother. And then suddenly, my father began to sing his father's melody. There was an uncertain quality to the way he sang the melody that night, as if we were winging through unknown worlds in search of sources of strength beyond himself. His eyes were open, but gazing inward. There was a sweetness and sadness, a sense of pain and yearning in his voice, soft, tremulous, climbing and falling and climbing again. And when he was done, there was a long silence. And in that silence, I thought I heard the distant cries, and I was afraid. Late that night, I came slowly awake from dream-filled sleep and heard the melody again and thought I was still dreaming. But even when I knew I was truly awake, the melody still went on. It was my father's voice coming from our living room. I saw him standing in front of the window. A huge Venetian blind had been pulled up. It stood rigidly perpendicular to the 2 triangles that were the window's frames. A single small light glowed faintly in the baseboard socket near the window, the light we left on in the room all through the Shabbos. It cast weak shadows across the floor and a soft reddish glow on my father's face. He stood looking through the window at the street outside, quietly singing his father's melody. He wore his dark red dressing gown over his pajamas. A tall skull cap covered his head. His side curls hung uncombed alongside his cheeks. The room was dark, save for a single weak nightlight. I stood in the doorway behind him and saw his face reflected in the window. I saw his eyes and watched his lips move. He held his hands to both sides of his head. Standing there with the room in shadows and his faintly illuminated features reflected in the window that looked out onto the dark street, he seemed to spread himself slowly across the wide night, to embrace and cover the darkness with the blanket of melody and soft light. My mother returned from the hospital, and my father stopped traveling. The Reb staff had suffered a number of casualties since its reorganization in America after the Second World War. One of its members had had a heart attack while on a mission in West Germany. A second had been in a serious car accident in Rome, and a third was badly beaten one night in Bucharest. There had been others, but My mother's brother was the first to die. There had been a special kind of relationship between my mother and her brother, and his death almost destroyed her. She had always been thin. She returned from the hospital skeletal. At first, I did not know who she was. I thought there had been an error, that somehow they had sent back the wrong person. For the first few days, she remained in her bed. Then she came out and moved, spectre-like, about the apartment in her nightgown, her eyes dark dead pools, her short dark hair uncombed and uncovered by a wig. She would not speak to anyone. I thought she had lost her voice until I heard her talking in the living room late one afternoon and found she was talking to herself. "You had to go?" she was saying. "Yes." "Why did you have to go? How will I cross the street?" I felt cold listening to her. I said to my father that night as he was putting me to bed, "Is my mama going to die?" He drew his breath sharply. "No, Asher, your mama is not going to die." "Is mama very, very sick?" "Yes." "Will mama get better?" "Yes, but with God's help. I want my mother to get better. I want to make pretty drawings for her." My father hugged me to him. I felt his beard on my face. "Now go to bed, Asher, and let me hear your Kriyas Shema." She wept easily. She tired easily. She cared nothing for the apartment, for food, for the things a person must do to stay alive. A woman came into the apartment every day to clean and to cook. Her name was Mrs. Scheindel Rakover. She was a widow with married children, short, plump, stern, energetic, and fiercely pious. She spoke only Yiddish. My mother avoided her. My mother avoided friends and relatives. She avoided me. She avoided my father. She seemed to cringe at the presence of another person. One day, sitting alone in our living room, she began to sing. It was a Hasidic melody, but I did not recognize it. She was imitating a soft voice. "Why does my mama sing that way?" I asked my father that night. "What way?" "In Uncle Yaakov's voice." He was helping me put on my pajamas. His hands trembled. "Your mother is remembering her brother. May he rest in peace." "Papa, you remember Uncle Yaakov?" "Yes." "You don't sing like that, Papa." He turned his head away for a moment. Then he said, "It's time for sleep now, Asher. Let me hear your Kriyas Shema." I found her alone in the living room one afternoon, about a week after she came back from the hospital. I said to her, "Mama, are you feeling better?" She gazed at me, but did not see me. Then I saw a flicker of light in her eyes. "Asher? Mama! Asher, are you drawing pretty things? Are you drawing sweet, pretty things?" I was not drawing pretty things. I was drawing twisted shapes, swirling forms in blacks and reds and grays. I did not respond. "Asher, are you drawing birds and flowers and pretty things?" "I can draw you birds and flowers, Mama. You should draw pretty things, Asher." "Shall I draw you a bird, Mama?" "You should make the world pretty, Asher. Make it sweet and pretty. It's nice to live in a pretty world." "I'll draw you some pretty flowers and birds, Mama. I'll draw them for you right now." "Never mind," she said sharply. She looked out the window. "It's not complete. Can it make a difference? Tell me how." And the dead look returned to her eyes. She seemed to hate the kitchen and would flee from its room soon as she was done eating. She never came into my room. She either lay in her bed, sleeping or staring at the ceiling, or she sat on the sofa in the living room, gazing out the window at the street below. She began to smoke. She sat in the living room, wreathed in smoke, the ashtrays on the end table beside her spilling over. Mrs. Rakover muttered to herself as she cleaned the ashtrays, but she said nothing to my mother. I began to find stubs of gray ash on the floor of the apartment. About 2 weeks after my mother returned from the hospital, I came in my parents' bedroom late in the morning and found her in bed. It was a large double bed. She lay beneath the green quilt, looking shrunken. Her face was sallow. Her bony hands protruded from the sleeves of her nightgown. She had seemed dead when I came in, but her eyelids fluttered open and she raised her head from the pillow and looked at me. She started to speak, stopped, and lay back on the pillow. She gazed up at the ceiling for a moment, then closed her eyes. Her closed eyes looked like ashen knobs in the blue-gray darkness of their sockets. I stood there for a long time. She seemed to be barely breathing. There was a strange, fetid odor in the air. I had come to show her a drawing I had made earlier that morning. It was a drawing of two birds. One of the birds was in the nest. The other was settling into the nest, its wings wide and fluttering. The nest was pale yellow. The birds were orange and deep blue, and there were green leaves and red flowers everywhere. There was a pale blue sky and white clouds and birds off in the distance. The bird in the nest had large, round, black eyes. I stood alongside the bed and watched my mother, slow breathing. "Mama," I said. Her eyes fluttered faintly but remained closed. "Mama," I said. Her hands moved then, and she turned her head toward me and opened her eyes. I held up the drawing. She gazed at it blankly. "Here are the birds and flowers, Mama." She blinked her eyes. "I made the world pretty, Mama." She turned her head away and closed her eyes. "Mama, aren't you well now?" She did not move. "But I made the world pretty, Mama." Still did not move. "I made more birds and flowers for you, Mama." Behind me, someone came quickly into the room. I felt a hand on my shoulder. "What are you doing?" Mrs. Rockover whispered fiercely in Yiddish. I made a drawing for my mama. I'm making my mama well." "Come away from here." Her fleshy face quivered. She seemed frightened. My mother would wake. "My mama asked me to make a drawing." "Come away," I said. She turned me forcefully around. I felt her pushing me out of the room. "What kind of boy disturbs a sick mother?" "I am surprised at you. A good boy does not do such a thing." She sent me to my room. I sat on my bed and stared at the drawing. Then I was frightened in the dark and trembling a way I never had known before I went to my desk. A long time afterwards, Mrs. Rockover called me to lunch. I found myself in front of a drawing filled with black and red swirls and gray eyes and dead birds. Relatives and friends came to visit my mother. Often, my mother would refuse to see them. Sometimes she would let my father persuade her to join a group of visitors in the living room. She would sit in one of the easy chairs, looking small and fragile, and say nothing. There would be awkward silences, feeble attempts at conversation, and more silences. In the moments, my mother seemed a ghostly spectator, hollow, without a core to her being. Her older sister, a short, robust woman in her early 30s, came in one day from Boston, where she lived with her husband and 4 children. She sat with my mother in our living room. "Rikava, you have a husband and a son. How can you neglect them? You have a responsibility." My father was in the room at the time. There were other relatives there too, but I do not remember who they were. "Look at the boy," my mother's sister said. "Look at him. He's dirty. How can you let him be so dirty?" "Asher is always dirty," my father said. "Even after he's bathed, he's dirty." "He should not be left alone." "How can you leave a little boy alone?" "He is not left alone. A boy left with a housekeeper all day is alone. A boy with children to play with, without children to play with, is alone." My father said nothing. "You should send him to your kindergarten." "Asher doesn't want to go to kindergarten." "Then he should come and live with me," my mother's sister said. "We have a big house. There are 4 children. A boy Asher's age should not be by himself all the time." "Asher likes being by himself." "It isn't healthy. It leaves scars." "You don't want to leave scars on the boy. Let him live with me." There was a brief pause. I felt myself shivering inside. "Let me think about it," my father said. My mother had been staring blankly at her sister and saying nothing. "It's wrong, Rivka," her sister said. "The boy will have scars." Then she said, "Rivka, it is forbidden to mourn in this way." My mother was very still. Rivka, the Torah forbids it. My mother sighed. Her frail body seemed to shrink even more in the large chair. Papa and Mama would have forbidden it, her sister said. My mother said nothing. Nothing. Rivka, her sister said. He was my brother too. A dark light flickered in my mother's sunken eye. The Torah forbids it, she said quietly. Is it forbidden? Yes? Yes, her sister said. But there are scars everywhere, my mother said. And who will hold my pennies? She stared out the window at the afternoon sunlight on the trees below. Who will tell me about the fox and the fish? Yaakov, you had to go? You left it unfinished. Who said you had to go? Then she lapsed into silence and would say nothing more. Her sister stared at her, open-mouthed. Then she turned her head away and shuddered. That night, alone in my room, I drew my Aunt Leah. I drew her in the shape of a fish, being eaten by a fox. What did the doctor say? I asked my father the next evening when he was helping me out of my clothes. To have patience. Will Mama get well? Yes. When? It will take a long time. Will you send me to live with Tante Leah? No. We'll think of something else. Now, let me hear your Kriya Shema, Asher. The weeks passed. The visitors ceased coming. In the first weeks of March, my father began to take me with him to his office. He worked at a desk in Ladover headquarters building, a block and a half away from where we lived. The building was three-story house of tawny stone with Gothic windows and a flagstone front porch with a white stone railing. It contained offices, meeting rooms, a room with about a dozen mimeograph machines, 2 suites of rooms for the editorial office of the various Ladover publications, and a small press in the basement. Men came and went all the day long. They sat behind desks, met in conference rooms, and rushed along corridors, talking frenetically, sometimes quietly, sometimes in loud voices. All the men were bearded and wore skull caps and dark suits and white shirts and dark ties. No women worked inside that building. Secretarial work was done by men. On the second floor of the house, in the apartment facing the parkway, lived the Reb and his wife. To the left of the entrance hall, beyond the carved wooden doors that led into the house, was a carpeted wooden staircase. There was an endless two-way traffic up and down that staircase. Men and women without beards, young men and old men, men who were obviously poor and men who were clearly affluent, men who were Jews and men who, it seemed to me, were not, and an occasional woman. Twice during those weeks, I saw a tall, gray-haired man in a black beret climb the stairs and turn into the second floor hallway. I noticed his hands. They were huge, rough, and calloused. I wanted to climb those stairs too, but my father had told me never to go beyond the first floor of the building. I would wander through the first floor of the building alone, trying not to get in anyone's way. People knew I was Arya Lev's son. They patted me on the head, pinched my cheek, smiled, nodded indulgently at my drawings. I took my pad and crayons with me every day and they fed me cookies and milk. My father's office was the third along the corridor in the right of the Edwards Hall. It was a small office with white walls, a dark brown linoleum on the floor, and a window that looked out onto the parkway. There were filing cabinets along the wall opposite the desk. The walls were bare except for a large framed photograph of the Reb that hung in the center window. My father's desk was old and scarred and seemed a relic of ancient academies of learning. It was cluttered with piles of papers and copies of Time, Newsweek, and the New York Times. Often he sat, tipped dangerously back in his swivel chair, his feet on the desk, his small velvet skull cap pushed forward across his red hair onto his forehead. He would sit reading a newspaper or magazine, and I would worry that he would fall over backwards. But he never did. There were 2 telephones on the desk. Frequently, he would talk into one or the other of them and write as he talked. Sometimes one of the men from another office would come in and sit on the edge of the desk and speak quietly with my father. I heard the word Russia often in those conversations. My father, he spoke English, Yiddish, or Hebrew into the phones. But the second week I was in his office, I heard him use a language I did not recognize. On our way back to the apartment for lunch, I asked him what language it had been. That was French, Asher, he said. I never heard my papa speak French before. I use it when I need it, Asher. I don't need it around the house. Does Mama speak French? No, Asher. Did you learn French in Europe, Papa? I learned it in America. The Reb asked me to study it. Didn't the Frenchman on the phone know Yiddish, Papa? The Frenchman on the phone wasn't a Jew. What did my papa speak to him about? You are full of questions today, Asher. Now I have a question. Your papa also has questions sometimes. Here is my question. Do you think Mrs. Rockover made chocolate pudding for dessert? You wanted chocolate pudding. Mrs. Rockover had not made chocolate pudding. Even when my father used the languages I understood, it was often not clear to me what he was saying. Calls seemed to come in from all over the country. He would listen and write. He would talk into the phone about the train and the boat schedules, about this person flying here and that person sailing there, about our community in New Jersey and did not have enough prayer books, another community in Boston that needed school books, a third community in Chicago whose building had been vandalized. And at the end of the day, behind the desk, he would be tired and a dark look would fill his eyes. I'm not made for this, he would say. I need people. I hate sitting with telephones. He would walk home with me in brooding silence. One day, he spent almost an entire morning on the telephone, arranging to move 2 Ladover families from somewhere in France to the United States. Why are they moving, Papa? I asked him on the way home. To be near the Reb. What is the State Department, Papa? He told me. Why did you talk to the man in the State Department? He's the man who is helping the families to come to America. How is he helping? Asher, you asked enough questions. Now it's my turn. Are you ready? Do you think Mrs. Rockover finally made chocolate pudding for dessert? Mrs. Rockover had indeed made chocolate pudding for dessert. My absence from the apartment had begun to mellow her. Late one afternoon, towards the end of March, I sat in my father's office drawing the trees I could see through the window. One of the telephones rang. My father put down his pen, picked up the receiver, and listened for a moment. I looked at his face and stopped drawing. Lines of anger forming around his eyes and along his forehead. 2 sharp furrows appeared above the bridge of his nose and between his eyes. His lips became rigid. He gripped the phone so tightly I could see the knuckles of his hands go white. He listened for a long time. When he finally spoke, it was in a voice of cold rage. He used a language I never heard before. He spoke briefly, listened again for a length of time, spoke again briefly, and then hung up. He sat at the desk for a moment, staring at the phone. He wrote something on a piece of paper, read it over what he had written, made some corrections, then picked up the paper and went quickly from the office. I sat there alone. One of the phones rang, then the second phone rang. The first one stopped ringing. The second continued. The ringing sounded suddenly piercing and thunderous inside that little office. I went out and spent the rest of the day on the flagstone porch, drawing the street. On the way home, I asked my father what language he had spoken. When you were angry, Papa? Russian, he said. Were you very angry, Papa? Yes. Did the man hurt you? No, Asher. He was telling me that some people are doing what some people are doing to hurt others. They're hurting Jews, Papa? Yes. We were walking together along the street. The parkway was clogged with a late afternoon traffic. There are lots of goyim in the world, Papa. Yes, he said. I've noticed. That evening, my mother refused to join us for supper. I heard my father, through the doors of their bedroom, pleading with her. Rivka, please, eat with us. We ask you to eat with us. You can't go on like this, Rivka. She would not move from the bed. Wait in heavy silence without her, served by Mrs. Rakover. Later that night, I was awakened by the sound of my father's voice. I went on bare feet along the hallway and looked into the living room. He was standing in front of the window, chanting softly from the book of Psalms. The next day, there were more phone calls in Russian. My father was tense and restless. Between calls, he sat staring morosely at the top of the desk. He went to the window and stood gazing out at the busy parkway. He paced the floor. He seemed caged. He saw me looking at him. I'm not made for desk, Sasha. He rubbed the side of his face. I should be there, not here. How can I spend my life talking on the phone? Who can sit all day like this? I like to sit, Papa. He gave me a dark, brooding look. Yes, he said, I know you like to sit. I held up the drawing I had made the morning of my father behind the desk talking into the telephone. It showed him with an angry face. It was before, when you were talking Russian, Papa. He looked at the drawing. He looked at it a long time. Then he looked at me. Then he sat behind the desk. One of the phones rang. He picked it up, listened for a moment, then began talking in Yiddish. I went out and spent the rest of the day on the porch, drawing the trees and cars and the old women on the benches along the street. My mother joined us for supper that evening. She smoked cigarette after cigarette. She had put on one of her blonde wigs, but it was awry and gave her head a grotesque, elongated look. My father tried talking to her, but she would not respond. Finally, he gave it up. We ate in silence. The cigarette smoke formed an acrid cloud around our heads. Mrs. Rickover moved about quietly. From time to time, I heard her sigh. Toward the end of the meal, I said abruptly, I made a drawing today, Mama. My thin voice sounded loud in a smoky silence of the kitchen. My father had been sitting tiredly over his food. Now he looked at me, startled. Yes, my mother said in a dead voice. Yes. Was it a pretty drawing? It was a drawing of my papa on the telephone. On the telephone, my mother echoed. She looked dully at my father. Asher, my father said quietly. It was a good drawing, Mama. Was it a pretty drawing, Asher? No, Mama, but it was a good drawing. Her eyes narrowed. They seemed tiny slits in blue-gray darkness of her sockets. I don't want to make pretty drawings, Mama. She lit another cigarette. Her hands trembled faintly. An odor rose from her fetid cloying. I put down my fork and stopped eating. My father took a deep breath. Mrs. Rockover stood very still near the sink. Yes, my father said. Her voice was sharp. I want the pennies now, Yakov. Rivka, my father said, please. You should make the world pretty, Asher, my mother whispered, leaning towards me. I could smell her breath.